Joining me today is Imogen Short. Imogen is the Asia Pacific Managing Director for Write the Talk. And Write the Talk is a creative agency that makes transformation work brilliantly for their people and their organizations. And they do this by delivering CPD-accredited narrative training programs for leadership to help them and empower them to influence and engage and inspire more authentically. And Imogen's journey to narrative building and storytelling began with spending over 12 years in the strategic communications space across the world, working with CEOs and leadership teams in how they build out their strategies for growth and progress. And alongside this, back in 2020, Imogen co-founded a production company, Three Wise Sheep Productions. And she took her storytelling into short film making and uses her voice to find new ways to work with comedy to tell fierce female stories and address really important topics. And now her award-winning short film, Sweet Corn, premiered at the BAFTA and Oscar-accredited LA Shorts Film Festival. And her multi-award-winning web series, Pivot, has been featured in the likes of Tatler Asia and The Female Lead. And so today I really wanted to dig in to storytelling, and those are the creds that go before Imogen, who is joining me today from Hong Kong, where she is living her best life by the beach, telling stories, making films, exploring the world, and competing as a trail runner. Imogen, welcome to the podcast.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks so much for a really good introduction. That's really kind of you to say all those things.
Yeah, well, it's why I was so excited to bring you on today, because I really wanted to get under the hood a bit of storytelling. I mean, books and stories and told in so many ways are always a part of our everyday lives growing up. They're so integral to our childhood. But certainly in my echo chamber, at least, I'm seeing more of the art of storytelling being brought into the corporate workspace and coming into the boardroom. And it strikes me that Write the Talk exists to sort of spread the gospel of storytelling to businesses. So from your perspective, Imogen, tell us what's in a story and why are stories and storytelling so vital to our daily lives?
Oh, it's a big question, but it's a really good one. So let me start with why storytelling is so powerful. So as human beings, storytelling is the way that we connect with each other, with the people around us that matter to us. And if you think about the role it's played in our species, it's how we communicate important things between generations. So it's about communication, it's about teaching, and it's about inspiring future generations. Steve Jobs famously said, the most powerful person in the world is a storyteller. They set the goal, the agenda, and the vision for generations to come. And what Jobs is really talking about is the fact that our brains are built to look for a narrative. So story is how we find our sense of place in the world and how we make sense of everything around us, from our personal beliefs to sort of global events taking place at macro level. If you think about the role of stories, especially at the moment, and especially in the last couple of years, stories really ignite movements. We've seen the likes of #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, really, really important seismic shifts in society happening because stories are driving those big momentums. And you think about back to Martin Luther King, he didn't stand up and say, I have a 10-point plan. He stood up and said, I have a dream. And that's a really, really impactful way of using storytelling to rally people around a cause. And really the reason behind that, if I'm allowed to just dip into some of the science, which I love, neuroscientists have shown that as human beings, our decision-making begins in the amygdala, which is the emotional epicenter of the brain. So that's where we subconsciously evaluate choices. And by the time we actually consciously become aware of them, we've already kind of made the decisions. That's where we get our gut feeling from. So logic and rational decision making is applied once we've sort of made that decision at a gut level. And the reason that storytelling is so powerful is because it connects at that emotional level, at that emotional epicenter. So a well-told story really, really speaks to the way that we make decisions. And it taps into more areas of the brain than data alone does. So when you're looking at how you move people, how you inspire people, how you motivate them to action, it really has to be grounded in storytelling and introducing, facts that add credibility, data that adds important credibility to what you're saying. But really, it's the compelling stories that make us listen, that make us change our behavior. And so that's really the power of storytelling. And, I'm really glad to hear that you're hearing more about it in the business context, because I think we've strayed away so much from using it in a business context, forgetting, how human business actually is. It's not institutions, it's not brands, it's human beings interacting with each other, whether it's employees, leaders, teams, customers, investors, and connecting with people at that level, at that emotional level, is really, really important for business. And so we're seeing a lot more of that, especially post-pandemic, where people are looking for authenticity, for compassionate leadership, for the journey ahead. And storytelling played such a huge role in that process. So it's good that we're getting the message out there. And I think to the second part of that question, what is in a story? I think we look at all different kinds of stories. I wrote my first story when I was something like 3. I think it was about a hat. And I wrote my first novel, finished my first novel when I was 16. It was for GCSE homework. And it was supposed to be a short story. It ended up being 100,000 words or something. And they published it in the library because I think they couldn't be bothered to read the whole thing. They gave me A star. So it's always been a huge source of inspiration and momentum in my own career. And knowing about different types of story and knowing how they work is really important to what we do. But we always start with the audience. I think knowing and understanding what your audience care about is really, really important. Because what you're trying to do is tap into what they care about and help connect with them emotionally and influence their decisions and their behaviors towards something that is, a common goal or a vision, whether it's within the business or in the team. And I guess coming back to the science of story as well, there are 2 essential things we look for when we develop a story. A lot of things happen in the brain when we experience a story, but there's 2 really essential things. The first is oxytocin, which is sort of the love hormone or the trust hormone.
Yeah.
And that's really about the character. So every story has to have a good character. And when I say good character, I mean a well-rounded character. So someone with strengths, someone with weaknesses, someone that we can relate to at a human level. And that's about authenticity. So how do you bring your character to the story? And character can be a leader, it can be a brand, it can be a change program. It has to have a certain kind of language, authenticity, a personality to it that brings it to life when you're telling that story and makes people care about what you're saying. So that's oxytocin, is around character. The other thing is really about cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which sounds really strange to want to provoke that in your audiences, but that's what storytelling does very well. And actually, at a moderate level, cortisol is really, really useful for keeping a focus of attention. So in a story, that character will be on a journey, whether it's psychological, physical, emotional, and they'll be overcoming a series of obstacles. And that's increasing tension through the story, that's raising cortisol levels in the brains of the audiences. And that's why we can't put down a good book, or that's why we press yes when Netflix says, do you want to watch another episode, right? Because they'll generally end on cliffhangers, which means the cortisol in your brain goes, I need to know what happens next. So in sort of business storytelling, this is really about how do you keep people engaged by being transparent? What kind of obstacles are you anticipating ahead? Where does the tension come in your story? And, for me, it's really about, even if you don't know what obstacles are ahead, it's about being open about that. And so that sort of explores your character as well as that tension and bringing people on that journey. So that's really how we look at stories, and we do that across sort of individual leadership, and then we do that across change programs, and they're slightly different ways of doing it, but essentially it's really about that character on that journey with an increasing sense of tension through that story.
Yeah. Gosh, that is like the story within the story within the story. There's so much in there, Imogen. Firstly, I loved that you brought in that science piece right into it, because, well, that's kind of speaking my language. And sometimes I think my theory of why there is sometimes these disconnects with, like, well, storytelling is this creative thing that you do when you're playing around, but when you're a grown up and you're now in a workplace, it is about the 10-point plan. It's not don't sometimes there's that if a CEO is going to do a Martin Luther King to his board, that can sometimes feel like that's not going to have the credibility of the PowerPoint deck with the 10-point plan and the graph comes behind it. But what you strung together there was how interconnected everything is, and how storytelling can be this thread to draw in the data and the facts and the message that you need to get across and this plan, but it does it in a way that's potentially more impactful than a graph and a PowerPoint, and that is to speak to people's emotions, to be able to actually connect the words that you're saying or the idea that you're trying to put across through this scientific process of saying I'm implementing this to reach this part of your brain, or to engage or help you support that release of oxytocin versus cortisol. And I know I'm a sucker for the autoplay and having to see that next episode on Netflix. To the point where actually I was reading a book in my work in tech, and I think someone had written a book on how addicted we are to it, and how do we manage our relationship with tech, and one of the tips is, like, you've got to stop an episode about 10 to 12 minutes before the end.
Interesting.
Because everyone, because it's always going to be, you can be watching like something that's actually pretty mundane and boring, but then they'll really bring it on in that last 10 minutes, so that you're forced to say yes. So like you have to end and start 10 minutes before the end of a previous or the end of the next episode. So that all makes so much sense. And it's interesting to me because, as I said, it's right. I really have seen it come up a lot more. I see a lot, we met on one of your sessions that was run for a group of us, and it shows that there is this real sense that there is value in this. And it's interesting that you said it is coming across more in these past few years, where I guess maybe there is a pressure to think that has come out of pandemic, big world events, to start to find that human connection into why things are happening, how we need to engage with people. I'm also maybe sometimes seeing, I don't know, this trend of right now there's a lot of pressure on leadership. I think there was a time when we just believe what our CEO tells us or a prime minister tells us, and that you just take it as read. And now there's a lot more people that will question it and question motivations, and it might be even just that general cynicism that now a leader is forced to have to tap into that level of authenticity and that kind of level of connection, where perhaps they would not previously have had to, and may not be comfortable doing so sometimes as well, even though they acknowledge that something has to change. How did your journey start into really honing in on storytelling as perhaps being one of the cruxes to leadership? Because we know that, you had spent a lot of your career in strategic communications. To the layperson like me, that sounds a lot more like the decks with the 10-point plans and the strategies and the charts kind of thing. But what happened for you, or through that experience, that made you realize, I think this storytelling piece comes at the real heart of this, and I want to actually delve into that as a niche?
Yeah, really good question. And I think to your point about how communications has changed, communication used to be leadership used to be a broadcast to whomever was sort of in the organization. It's now much more of a conversation, a dialogue. So leaders are actively listening. There's a lot of work being done on compassionate leadership, which is very much about listening to stories and sharing stories. And I think the more leaders we're seeing step into that space, the more authenticity they're building within an organization. And in an ideal organization, I think I'm a big fan of Brené Brown, and she said this really, really powerful thing that I've never forgotten. She said, the opposite of fitting in is belonging, right? And a lot of us go to work or went to work and looking for a place to fit in where you can sort of get your job done 9 to 5 and then go home at the end of the day. And that's work, and then you've got life outside that. And that was certainly my experience. Sort of many years back, coming up through the corporate ranks. Whereas belonging is actually feeling like you are welcome, like all elements of your life are welcome, where you feel comfortable sharing stories. And I think that has been a big shift in the way that companies communicate to employees, because where we were comfortable previously, and the pandemic saw a huge shift in this, where we're comfortable fitting in, you're okay with the broadcast that doesn't necessarily have the personality of a leader. It just says what the company needs you to know. And then you go home and you live your life outside of work. Whereas what people are looking for now, and the pandemic has expedited that, is this authentic sense of leadership and sharing a little bit of vulnerability as a leader. And then that sort of invites an emotional connection. So I think if you sort of look at communication pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, it's changed. And I know, we work with a lot of internal comms teams, a lot with change management teams. The shift they've seen in terms of having a seat at the table, because the pandemic really was about employee engagement. And so that's been a huge welcome shift, because I think previously it was sort of a post box. I know I was in some roles where it was just kind of like, can you send this message out? You can edit it if you like, but essentially it just needs to go to however many thousand employees. Whereas now it's like, it's about a conversation about what do people need to know, what do they care about, how do we want to make them feel, and so that I think has been an amazing shift. And certainly, I started to write the talk 7.5 years ago, and we predominantly were focused on change management, because my background and my CEO's background are in sort of change management and communication, and you can just see why change programs fail. The way that they are currently run, right? So what's that amazing stats, and like 70% of change management programs fail. And when you look into it, and we did a research paper on this a couple of years ago, the majority of them fail because the human beings at the center of that change and running that change aren't communicating as human beings. So you've got employees who are resisting the change before it even starts, and leaders who aren't equipped to take people on that change journey. So that was really the first area we tackled, was developing change narratives that worked like long-running TV series. So how do you engage people season after season, episode after episode, across years, across months, to really get them invested in the story, to make sure that they're not, finishing at the end of the episode and not going on to the next one. I would say month by month, how do you keep them engaged? So that was really where we started, and the response to that was phenomenal. We worked on big change programs across the world, and then we introduced leadership training, because we saw the need. We had leaders asking us about helping them upskill as storytellers, so that when the change was happening, they were equipped to lead people through that. And so we introduced our CPD accredited training and a series of masterclasses, and the two complement each other really well. And what we saw in the pandemic was the need for training just exploded, because leaders are suddenly saying, okay, I need to be a much more compassionate leadership. I need to be able to lead this team, even though I don't know where we're going or what's going to happen next. So that really became a huge opportunity for us to help people become more authentic at work, and to lead people through what was essentially, this huge period of uncertainty. So we were in a really good place to help people, I think. And that's really, the pandemic was a terrible, terrible thing. But to feel like you could be in a place to help people, I think, we really did feel like we were making a difference to the human beings within an organization. And for us, it's always been about the human beings, right? And I think the more people naturally resist change, which is sort of the paradox of change, because change is happening all the time. But if you can turn that resistance into momentum, then you're putting yourself on the front foot immediately before the changes even happen. And that's really what we work to do. And I think story has always been the engine behind change, behind leadership. It's just not been tapped into in the way that it needs to be, and that's part of our job is sort of helping people understand that.
Yeah. Or I feel like I'm going to need to use that visual or that phrase of, using that, taking that resistance to change and turning it into momentum. That's always the challenge, and it's always been a bugbear of mine. But now, it's really interesting to see the rise of the so-called soft skill, which is so I think is so integral and necessary. But the reality is that it doesn't feature heavily in the training of who the generation who are now that senior management, and so it is quite a shift. And I also, I suppose, bringing it constantly back to this, how do you relay the same arc that you might see in a TV show or in these long-standing series and other art forms to that business world? I often think, and particularly, I know you made short films really tackling things like gender equality and using comedy and story to put across really strong messages. And as someone that works in that, in the inclusion space and as a coach, on one hand, I know that, you need to really believe in something to actually execute on something. And then, I'll watch, you'll watch a Bridgerton or, anything by Shonda Rhimes in my book that you just think that is pushing equity and inclusion so much further, so much faster than any unconscious bias workshop that I may do is going to do. And so I suppose, can we get some practical tips here? If we're not a Shonda Rhimes, or if we're not an Imogen short filmmaker, what are some of the key tips and tools that we can use in our day-to-day lives, in our work to start to bring storytelling to the consciousness of our work? Because sometimes that won't always immediately come. And then, can you give us a little bit of a taster of some of the really practical things that you would convey to leaders to thread storytelling into their work?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess there's a couple of things I would say. For leaders, I think, we run an 8-week program, which is really about, it starts with understanding who you are, and then it sort of ends with how do you use that to lead people through whatever is next. So I think the first thing is to really understand who you are as a character. I think we work with people who, we work with different kinds of people all over the world, but there's sometimes a sense of this institutionalization, where you've worked with the company for so long and you've been telling the company message for so long that you're not quite sure how to switch to a more authentic version of that messaging. And so one of the things we work on is the character. So who are you as a character? What does that mean for the way that you communicate and the language that you use and your behaviors? And so we try and tap into that more authentic self. So I think the starting point needs to be, who are you as a character? And how does that manifest in your communications, and how are you different from everyone else? And one of the most interesting exercises I think we do is we get people to sort of work on their character. We take them through an exercise, and at the end of that exercise, they'll have a sort of a list of characteristics that describe their character, and then we'll put on the screen a list of characteristics that they're not allowed to use to describe their character. It's generic words like unapproachable, innovative, friendly, And that's really not what we're looking for. We're looking to get to the granular level of detail, which is really you, because every single person is incredibly unique. So how do we tap into that? How do we explore that? And how do we enable leaders to use that in their communications? So I think character is really, really important. And I think, once you've got a sense of that and how that's different from everyone else and how that sort of comes across in language, you can then look at, okay, what are the stories that I need to tell? So every single story plays a different kind of role. You've got Hollywood who make billions of dollars a year dictating the emotions of their audiences. You've got sort of tragedies, comedies. Shonda Rhimes does it incredibly well. 1 minute you can be crying and the next minute you're laughing. So she understands how story works to provoke reactions. And so what we do with a lot of leaders is build sort of a library of stories that they have that are personal to them, that they can use to influence different responses. So, when you're talking about using story and data, and I think, obviously there's a huge interplay of story and data. They work really well together. You should never really have data without story. I think story provides the amazing context, and then data in story helps provide credibility. But knowing which stories to draw upon when you stand in front of your exco or your leadership team can make a powerful difference to how they receive that presentation. So some of the things we work on are, how do you pitch your idea within 2 minutes using a story framework that gets people bought in before you even get to your presentation? And so having that library of different stories you can use is really important. And I'd say, start with your origin story. Who are you and how did you get to where you are? And that really invites people to connect with you at an emotional level. And then look at the other story types and what they do and the kind of emotional response they evoke in your audience. And then have a go at developing them for yourselves. I think that's really where I think leaders need to start. And then I think once you're comfortable with stories, how do you work them into your daily working life? Can you start your team meetings with a story about your weekend, or about, if you're going through a change program, have you been through this kind of change program before, and how was it, and what did you come up against? How do you share stories from your past experience? And so working it into your daily working life is a really powerful thing to do. And also, stories are about listening as well. So inviting people to share their stories creates a sense of shared experience, right? And then you begin to understand more about each other, and that's where you create that empathy and sort of that compassion between people. And so that's really where we work with leaders. And that I think, you mentioned it sort of as a soft skill. I think in the last couple of years, it's become sort of a very commercial skill that creates more well-rounded leaders. I think if you're very hard on the technical, what you call the harder skills, then you need to round that out with more compassionate leadership. And that's really what people are expecting in terms of leadership in the modern world. So that's leaders. And then I think, when you're thinking about taking people through change, we've used the creative process that big production companies use to develop long-running drama. So the same process that went into Game of Thrones that I'm sure Shonda Rhimes uses at some level. And we apply that to business. So we look at how we want people to feel by the end of a change program and what they need to know in order to get there. And we develop 3 or 4 sort of key storylines. So if you think about a television program that runs for a long time, you have storylines weaving through that television program. Each episode will be about 2 or 3 different storylines. And that's designed to keep your attention focused. So it's all working within the same narrative, but you're not always saying the same thing, and people aren't becoming sort of, fatigued by repetition. So we'll work on the change programs, look at the big storylines, and then we'll look at how they ebb and flow over time. So in this month, which storyline are you talking about? What's your secondary storyline? And it gives you a really good sense of what that year is going to look and feel like. Which means that you can then break that down by month. So in February, we're talking about this storyline. We're also introducing this storyline because we know that in March, that's what we're going to be talking about. So it's a more sophisticated way to think about communication strategy, because you have the big picture that means you can then go down, okay, this month it's about this, and therefore we need to be sending this out on this day. We need to be talking about this on this day. So you can go big picture right down to granular detail. And that's really what they do when creative teams workshop, when writers' rooms workshop big drama series, big television series. They take it from the ebb and flow of storylines, and they put it into the daily, what does this actually look like on the screen? Yeah. And so it's a really structured process to get from this creative sense of, okay, what are we trying to achieve, through to, okay, on Tuesday you need to send this communication. So and it all builds towards this story. So I think rather than seeing communication as a single narrative that gets repeated, look at it as a fluid series of storylines that ebb and flow over time. And it makes your life a lot easier when you're taking people through that change, because you're not repeating the same thing, and you don't have too much going on, and you don't have nothing going on. You've got a really comfortable level of communication through the air. I mean, it's not an easy process, I will say that, but it is a very rewarding one. Once you get to that level of understanding how that change program is going to unfold at a human level, then you can really begin to see how it engages people differently.
Yeah, I feel like you've just transformed my perception and perspective on change management.
Oh, good.
It's something, and I hear change management, it's always and again, as someone that works for change at a human level, I really resist that term in anything that I do, when effectively we know that is a form of it. Yeah. So you've really reframed that in a way that is so much more, that makes so much more sense to me, actually. And it's just more appealing just in and of itself when you're building that in, and you can bring the drama of that writer's room and understanding that there is structure and real work that goes into a creative process. And there were a couple of other things. Now, you talked about authenticity and that need for authenticity, which it's something that is another thing that runs at the heart of everything I do. But I'm also quite conscious that term in and of itself gets bandied around a lot, or has a lot of different interpretations, particularly in that corporate space. But what you then kind of brought it down to that next level, what I was hearing from the start of this process is self-awareness. And that there is this real process in the first instance of being really sure, because actually that in and of itself can be a harder task than you'd think. And I found even with coaching, people come in with an idea of a goal or what they want and what they want to achieve. And then you kind of realize it's not necessarily something that they actually really want in their heart of hearts. It's kind of what they should, or, or they think they should, or their boss has told them they should go for this and it sounds kind of okay. And really taking that time to nut down and go beyond those initial generic quote unquote sort of words, which again, we're just fed. That's been the narrative that we've been fed for so long. And now you need to shift that narrative and use yourself and your origin story as the derivation of that as a piece. So there is the self-awareness and authenticity piece that is a takeaway to start with. And it reminds me of back when we were taught to write and doing writing as a kid. It's, write what you know. And that's what's always going to have that bigger impact. So there's that self-awareness piece. I think that other big practical takeaway for me was this idea of having a library of stories, and just thinking. Now I'm thinking of if something comes to you, or there's times and places when you always have there's always a story that might come up, but you don't necessarily know how to deploy it in the right way in, say, a professional context. And the idea that you can have these already kind of in the back of your mind and have kind of collated them and actually sort of assigned them, a category or an emotion or a theme that that'd be useful for, is again a really good practical way to turn what can feel like this creative, unattainable process to something that you can really break down into that science. And the other sort of, I guess that buzzword that comes to mind along with authenticity was purpose, which is something that, again, drives a lot of people in terms of, especially senior leaders trying to galvanize people on board, when one day you might just be having to sit at a desk and fire out 12,000 emails. But if you know where this sits in the story and where we're at in this process, and you have this sense of purpose to what you're doing, and you can add that, it then suddenly becomes, no, I'm not just doing 12,000 emails. I'm at this stage of creating the change that we're trying to implement, or kind of we're at this stage of this part of this story. And it seemed like a really interesting thing for people to take away, to think about when you're working with teams that are undermotivated, or even if you're not doing this big change management piece, just on that day-to-day level, can we go to the heart of what does that email actually mean, or what does something that looks like a mundane task actually mean, and have we stopped to think about it, and have we stopped to think about how that relates to what our own purpose is, and how we can kind of integrate it. So I really like that idea of how we integrate, and how you kind of start to get your brain engaged with this idea that it's connected. And the last one is the data piece. It comes up a lot, right? And because again, we're just used to thinking if we throw stats at the issue, people will go go with it. And I know there's a lot of science to say that actually that's not the case. And you sort of explain that a bit for us in terms of it's actually the emotion first, and actually this notion that you've already made up your mind, and the rest is the logic bit is just the layer on the top, where so often we focus on that. And actually, when you're thinking of Brene Brown, the one that I love from her is stories are data with a soul. I think that's right.
Brilliant.
And I love that. It's like, the number itself means nothing without the story that it goes along and the emotion that you appeal. So thanks for that. I feel like that's like a starter kit, and I know that I've had the experience of doing one of the Write the Talk workshops, which I really took so much away from in terms of that idea of structure. And as I said, for people that are quite like logic brained, it just goes, oh no, there is a formula to these things, and then you can put your kind of sense of self feeds in at various junctures of that process. And I feel like, so look, this podcast, as you know, it's called Unbiased. And you yourself, as I said, have moved me from this having certain perceptions of things like change management into like, I can see how this could work in a way that appeals certainly to me, and to how I could affect change and use stories to affect change. And I feel like a big part of why I have these conversations is just to kind of trigger those, or kind of stop ourselves when we go right into having a judgment about something. It's why, as I said, I hate that term soft skill, like as if it's something that is lesser than a hard skill, but to really kind of shift from judgment to curiosity. And as part of that, I think that we always feel like we need to have the answers to everything, but actually to have like a meaningful life, to tell meaningful stories, there needs to be more questions than answers. There needs to be that sense that, what's coming next?
Yes,
what's going on?
A lot of people see data and story as sort of this dichotomy that you can either have one or the other. And I think, the work that we just sort of round that off, I think data plays an incredible role in credibility and evidence. And I think a lot of people look for that, especially in a business sense, but it lacks the emotional connection to engage people at a human level and at a scientific level. I think also data can feel quite abstract when we talk about data, especially when we talk about big data. X% of this does this, and therefore we need to do this. So when we developed Pivot, which is based on unconscious bias that women face at work, we were using a stat at the time, which I think was by Deloitte, which looked at something like 1/3 of women experience non-inclusive behavior at work, whether that's sort of unwanted physical contact through to questions about their judgment because of their gender. And so 1/3 of women experience that, and it got worse through the pandemic. And that sort of, it surprises you because it's such a big number. But what we wanted to do through Pivot was to show how that actually feels for a single character. So I think if you can make data about an individual experience through story, the impact is much bigger because you're connecting at that emotional level. You've still got the data, but you've got a human being going through this experience, and you're showing how it, actually engages, actually how it feels. And so you're bringing that data to life through story. And I think that's really, really powerful, and certainly something that we help leaders, or try to help leaders do more powerfully, to give their data context in different kinds of ways. So I think the marrying of data and story is really, really powerful, and something we should all be thinking about doing a lot more. And that's certainly what we were trying to do through Pivot, and our sort of hapless protagonist, Mel, who was really up against a lot of barriers. And that was really the result of drawing on some of that research, but also speaking to women about their experiences and using their actual experiences to inform the scripts before we even started writing. So the marrying, I think, is really important. And data certainly does play a role, but how do we make it human? And that's where story, I think, comes in.
because we so easily kind of get desensitized to these big numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really kind of bringing it back home. And thank you for bringing up Pivot. I loved it. I'll put the link on the show notes.
Oh, fantastic.
As we mentioned earlier, it's using comedy to address these really big issues. And I think comedy is one of the best modalities to really shine a light on what is a reality. So absolutely. So there's so much to take away in that, for sure, Imogen. And so as I've been asking my guests to leave us with each time in our quest to move from judgment to curiosity. I think we should always have more questions than answers. And I want you to leave us, Imogen, with a question that remains unanswered for you, however many experts there may be weighing in on this field.
Yeah, I love this question, because I actually think that stories sometimes create more questions than they do answer them, and that's part of how we explore the human condition.